Everyone ready? Okay. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Zachary Peterson. I'm a professor in the computer science department. I teach security. I'm also the advisor of this club. Sorry. Yeah. I do try to come to these things, but it's anyways. Life happens. Anyways, one of my areas of interest is in crypto and largely cryptographic engineering. How do we actually build systems using crypto? How to build secure systems? And it turns out to be really, really hard in practice. And we often don't see failures like in the very core primitives, although I'll show some today. What we see is in how we build those primitives or kind of put those primitives together. And our understandings of how protocols work, our understandings of how the interactions between certain primitives and how they behave. And we haven't had a good history with thinking or reasoning about the security of crypto protocols and systems, or in industry, including academics, who may have a better understanding. Now, that's unfortunate because we've made a lot of decisions that we've kind of been stuck with. And the kind of canonical example I'll poke fun at the most is SSL TLS, right? This is the protocol that we use for creating secure sockets, largely for how we securely web surf. Right? It's the thing that kind of provides end-to-end encryption between your web browser and the web server. And we've seen just numerous flaws, both in terms of the protocol and in terms of how those primitives are used. Okay, so I'm going to give you the top 3 crypto fails in my mind, but kind of not really. What they're really going to be are actually kind of 3 classes of failures that, and we'll look at specific examples that are pretty well known. But we're going to kind of focus on maybe a higher level philosophy on how crypto tends to fail in practice, right? One of those is we actually do sometimes, very occasionally, but sometimes find failure in the primitive. So what do I mean by a primitive? Well, we essentially have these core building blocks. And one of those core building blocks, as you may be familiar with, is like AES, right? AES, the Advanced Encryption Standard, is what we call a block cipher. And by itself, it has some neat properties, but not very useful. So essentially what it takes in is a small message of a fixed size, 128 bits. And it takes in a key, usually 128 bits, sometimes 192, sometimes 256. And it outputs 128 bits. Okay? And what it does is essentially creates this pseudo-random mapping from the input space to the output space. That's really hard to figure out unless you have that key. Okay? Now that permutation is something we call a pseudo-random permutation, or a PRP, right? So things can go in, and it gets mapped in a weird way, and you can unmap it back again, right? So you can encrypt and you can decrypt as long as you have that key. And if you don't have the key, then it's very, very hard. Okay, we don't say it's impossible, right? We just say it's kind of difficult, right? Even if you start guessing keys, you never get through a meaningful number before the sun burned out. Okay, that's when we talk about like hard. Okay, so by itself, like we can reason about the mathematical properties of that. And we tend not to see failures in there, although occasionally. Where we see then is when we use that primitive as part of a larger implementation, and that's the second category. So by itself, right, maybe you'll see some failures, but oftentimes when we try to chain that thing together, right, because we don't want to encrypt just 128 bits, right? We want to encrypt arbitrary sized files or arbitrary sized messages. So how do we kind of like chain those things together? How are we going to put those blocks together in order to do meaningful decryptions? Well, if we don't do it quite right, crypto tends to fall apart really quickly, right? Crypto is very fragile. That's like a Fabergé egg, right? And like the smallest crack will tend to, I don't know, or Fabergé eggs fragile, they look fragile. So then the last was, now even if we have a secure system, or a secure, let's call it a secure system. We've kind of built the crypto right. Now we need to start talking crypto back and forth to each other. So again, I think of a client-server model. How do we do that, right? What are the right languages that the right messages we need to say to each other? The right order? What are the kind of the contents of those messages? Those kind of fall into our third category, which is failures of protocol. All right, so let's start with some primitives. This is an example of a broken primitive. So there was once, and I guess it still exists, a primitive called RC4. It was invented by Ron Rivest. I think RC is supposed to stand for Ron's code. Ron Rivest is the R in RSA, so a pretty famous cryptographer, has done a lot of good work, and so by no means am I trying to like slander his work. This is actually only a recent discovery. I think it was maybe over 25 years or 30 years that RC4 was kind of believed to be secure. Well, what is RC4? It's actually a pseudo-random number generator. Okay, so it's not a block cipher. It can be used for encryption, but essentially what you do is you put in a seed or maybe like a key, and what it outputs are pseudo-random bits, or in this case, bytes. Okay, so you kind of think of it like a box, and you can turn the crank, and out comes some randomness. But it's pseudo-random. I mean, if you put the same key in every time, you're going to get the same outputs. So that kind of seems, well, wait a minute, how's that random? Well, how we define the security of a pseudo-random number generator is, can you predict what the next bit's going to be? Or another way of thinking about that, kind of an equivalent way of saying that is, if I gave you the output of RC4, could you distinguish it from something that was actually truly random? Okay, what is truly random? Well, kind of like you have to philosophically believe we live in a universe that is non-deterministic, right? That we don't live in all in hologram. So there's some evidence either way on that. But let's presume for a moment that there is something as a true random, right? Like flipping a coin. Right? What would you expect to look like? Well, maybe an even number, an even distribution of heads and tails, right? There'd be a certain number of run. There's some kind of statistical properties that random produces. And if my output of my PRNG looks like something that's random, I'm going to say, oh, that's pretty close to random. That's close enough that I can now use this for cryptographic purposes, right? We can use it for encryption, or we maybe even use it for generating cryptographic keys. So if RC4 is supposed to output random bytes, what is the probability of a single byte coming out of RC4? Ideally, what should it be?
1 out of 256.
Exactly, 1 out of 256. And if you were to do that division, it is 0.00390625. Okay? And so what we're looking at here is all the byte values between 0 and 255. And so an ideal RC4, right, would essentially output bytes along this straight black line. The blue line is what it actually outputs, okay? And this is at, position 1, meaning so if you were to give it a bunch of keys, and they went through a tremendous number of keys. This is Alfared, and they basically close the book on whether RC4 is a secure PRG. It is not, okay? And for this reason, they just jammed a bunch of keys into it, and they measured what the byte was, the first byte, right? Yeah, so it turns out 128 doesn't show up all that often, okay? It kind of curves in this really interesting way. As it turns out, this has been known for a while, that maybe the first couple bytes exhibit some non-uniform distribution on its probability distribution on its output. So the common solution was like, oh, well, let's just run it for a little bit. Let's warm up this algorithm, right? And as it turns out, every single byte position has something that looks like this. And once you have something that looks like this, you can now start guessing what the plain text bytes, or kind of what that byte's going to be, and I can start guessing cryptographic keys. Okay, so RC4, not so good. So we've abandoned RC4 in all of our protocols, right? No, and so it's still supported in many versions of TLS that we see on the web today. So if you ever go to Qualsys, there's this thing called SSL Labs, and they run essentially a test on TLS servers. It'll output it, kind of give it a letter grade from F to A+. And one of the things that it measures is, are you still using RC4? And it will kind of cap your grade to some level if you still are. People still are. Why? Because RC4 is really easy to implement, for one, and it's really fast. And so if you're someone like Google and you need to support millions of TLS connections a second, speed matters, right? And so for a long time, Google was using RC4. In fact, it was kind of considered the standard until it had this problem. So we had to move away from the stream cipher. Now there are other PRNG candidates, right? Cha-Cha, I think, is a Daniel Bernstein creation that is believed to be a good candidate for PRNG. Do we know? No. One of the things about crypto is it can't really prove anything one way or the other, right? We can't prove it isn't. We can't prove it is. We're going to live in a mysterious world until someone does something like this. Okay. Yeah. All right. So here's what we're looking at here is something that comes out of a TLS negotiation, and we'll see that kind of there's kind of two steps to TLS, right? When you connect to a secure web server, it basically says, let's agree upon some stuff. Okay, let's do some handshake. And then once we agree upon some stuff, then we'll generate a secret key, and then we'll kind of communicate, we'll encrypt our communications from there. That's called the record part of the protocol. So this is what's called the Cipher suite. So I think this must be the client. Yeah, the client hello. So the client says to the server, hey, I'd like to talk TLS. Here are all the things that I can talk. And the fact that TLS kind of supports all these things is a little crazy sauce, if you ask me. But you kind of see all the various algorithms, right? So the Diffie-Hellman exchange. So how are we going to agree upon a secret key? Well, we use Diffie-Hellman. It's ephemeral. We're going to protect that ephemerality, or protect those parameters with RSA. And then once we've agreed upon a key, we'll use AES-256 in CBC mode with a SHA-based HMAC. Okay, so that's kind of how you decipher this long string of things. Now, there's a couple of things you want to notice here. Okay, SSL2 RC4 128 with MD5. Okay, this includes exactly 2 terrible, like weak now primitives: RC4, MD5. Right, and I'll show MD5 in just a second. Okay, other things that are in here: DES. Okay, DES. DES is a real trooper. No one has actually found any, as far as I know, any statistically meaningful attacks against DES. It's still a very good PRP. Okay, the problem is key too small. Okay, it's only 56 bits. That's something that was secure, computationally secure, when our computers were really slow. And now that we have massively parallel systems that can, brute force that space, reasonably well, then DES no longer has any security properties. We can kind of put DES into some crazy mode called triple DES, and that may be on here somewhere, 2, 3 DES. Yeah, up here. Yeah, that increases its security, but it also means you're calling that DES 3 times, which gets a little expensive, right? So we talk about the computation cost. So we tend not to use that too often, except for maybe backwards compatibility. Okay.
Is there also DES with MD5? Bottom? Oh.
Yeah, DES. What is that? Yeah, DES 64. I'm not sure that's different.
Yeah, what's DES?
Yeah.
I've got CDC.
Yeah, I should also, truth be told, this is a very old version of TLS I'm showing here. SSL, well, so it's not even TLS yet. SSL 2.0. First of all, if I say SSL,
It's TLS version 1 up there, version TLS 1.0.
SSL 2.0, I think it says.
And then under
version
down.
TLS.
Oh, yeah, I have to think about.
Is it TLS 1.0 operating SSL?
That's a good question. I don't know the protocol well enough to figure out what that means. Sorry.
It could have been in the intermediary time period where both were really commonly used.
That's right. Well, so the fact that SSL 3 is still kind of used pretty commonly, even though it's got some pretty serious flaws with it. So just everyone knows that if I say SSL and TLS, it's the same thing. Okay. Basically, as far as I know, there's a little bit of a political upset because SSL was invented by Netscape. And they created Navigator, maybe back in the browser wars, or Microsoft had IE, and Netscape had their Navigator, and they were kind of fighting. And this kind of became the standard, and I think as part of that standards process, Microsoft lobbied to remove the Netscape stink from it, or something like that. I don't know. That may be folklore. Anyways, SSL. There's SSL1, which was secret. There was kept secret by Netscape. SSL2, which was released, and then had some really serious flaws. And one of my colleagues, Matt Green, says, in 1995, that's kind of, I think, when SSL2 hit the streets. And maybe that doesn't seem like that long ago. But often in a talk very similar to this, he holds up a picture of Will Smith, circa 1995. And it's like, yeah, those are like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air days. And that doesn't seem that long ago, but if you look at Will Smith, right, that was a totally different time, right? And so same here. It was like crypto, especially in the corporate world, was a totally different time, right, than it is now. I think there was just kind of a lack of understanding. So anyway, SSL2, a ton of problems. SSL3 came out, it was better, and still had a number of problems that we're still working with today. SSL3 then got revised and became TLS 1, 1.0. And I think the current version is 1.2, and 1.3 is in draft form and under the Internet Engineering Task Force. So we still see problems with every single version. There's not a single version of TLS that doesn't have some kind of critical problem with it. Okay. The other thing I want to show as a failure of primitives is MD5. Okay, so what is MD5? MD5 is a hash function. Okay, it's a cryptographic, or once was considered a cryptographic hash function. What is a hash function? Well, a hash function basically takes large amounts of data and outputs a small amount, a fixed-sized chunk. And so in the case of MD5, is 128 bits. Okay, so you take any size input and it outputs 128 bits. That doesn't sound like that interesting, right? So we just grab the first 128 bits. No, actually, what made it cryptographic, the core cryptographic, the secure definition is that it's collision resistant. That means it's hard to find any two messages that you stick into the hash function that produce the same output. Okay, will you find one? Yeah, sure, right? It's an inevitability, right? You could put in 2 to the 128th plus 1 inputs and being guaranteed to find one. And actually, probability says that you'll actually find one at about square root in the size of the domain. So it's more like 2 to the 64 inputs. That's still a lot, okay? Turns out MT5 is not so good. We can find collisions in about 2 to the 20th now. In fact, there's been some targeted collisions, and I wanted to show you one that I thought was pretty good. All right, so here are 2 different PostScript files. Okay, one is a order from Julius Caesar. Right, it says give Alice Falbala all confidential and secret information about Gaul. Okay, and then you got this letter of recommendation. Right, which is Julius Caesar says Alice Falbala fulfilled all the requirements of the Roman Empire, intern position, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, 2 totally different files, right? Shouldn't create the same digest, right? All right, so we can actually do that, of course. So here we have the MD5 of the letter of rec. Okay, there. That's essentially a hexadecimal representation of MD5, and if we do MD5 of order. That looks pretty similar. Okay. There's actually services out there that actually find targeted collisions for you now. There's actually the Flame malware found. Where do we use hash functions? Well, we use them for creating message authentication codes. We'll talk about those in a second. And actually, MD5 is still okay for using collision resistance. Isn't required for creating HMACs, secure HMACs. However, we do use it in signatures. And we use signatures on things like certificates. And Flame basically found a collision on MD5 that allowed them to forge a certificate. They got to pretend to be a Microsoft code signing certificate. And by they, I of course mean the NSA. Right? Okay. Flame. The most interesting part of Flame is that the code that found those collisions used a technique that even academics weren't aware of at the time. So that was pretty neat. Okay. All right, so we've had some failures in the primitives themselves, but for the most part, those tend to be pretty rare, right? At least rare compared to things like implementation. Okay. So let's take a look at this code. All right, so what is this code doing? This came from OpenVPN. This is a very common way of doing this. Kezar, Google's crypto library, had the same flaw. Okay, so first of all, what are we doing here? What is an HMAC? Well, what is a MAC, first of all? A MAC is another kind of crypto primitive that takes in a message and it takes in a key and it produces a tag. Okay? Doesn't provide any confidentiality, doesn't really do anything to the message, it just provides this tag. And what that tag says is you can't tamper with this message with high probability without being detected. So if I was to send you a message and a tag, and we had agreed upon some key, you could then stick in that message and stick in the key and get the same tag and see if it matches. And so it should be hard for me to create a forgery, right? That's kind of the security definition, that it should be very difficult. So given a message, can I create a valid tag without knowledge of that secret key, right? And if the tag is 128 bits, then it would take me a long time to guess one, right? Okay, so that's an HMAC. So what we're looking at here is that particular piece of code that does the verification, right? So I've received a message and its corresponding MAC. The H in HMAC, it's hash. There's a hash-based function. There's lots of ways we can construct MACs internally. This one uses a hash function on the inside. Okay, so you kind of think about, I'm going to receive a message and a MAC, and I'm going to compute the MAC itself, right, the local one that I computed, and I'm going to compare it with the one that I got. Okay, and I'm going to compare the length. And so I'm going to look byte by byte. And if it returns anything but 0, right, I'm going to return an error, right, that the MAC failed. What's the problem here, do you think? This is a piece of problematic code, right? But this is totally what we all write when you compare two things. Next.
Mac oracle?
Yeah, what's that?
A Mac oracle?
A timing oracle. Yeah. So what is an oracle? An oracle is essentially something you can kind of like ask a particular question to, and it gives you an answer. So one of the things you can do is create encryption oracles. So it's like, hey, I want an encryption of this. What does that look like? Okay. Or I want a decryption oracle. Like, hey, I'm going to give you some random data. What does the decryption look like? Or I'm going to give you a MAC and a message. I'm going to measure how long it takes for you to compute whether this returns an error or returns success. So think about what the attack might be. So I'm going to get a message. And basically what I do is I want to forge a message. And it's going to be hard for me to like go through all 128-bit values. But what I can do is take it byte by byte. I can go through 0 through 255 for the first byte and measure how long each one of those takes. And if it fails on the first byte, it's going to return quickly. But if it doesn't fail on the first byte and goes on to the second byte, that's going to take a little bit longer. Okay? So now I know what that first byte is. Now I can guess the second byte. Now I can guess the third byte. Now this is, it's not foolproof, right? It's not necessarily a deterministic function because there's a lot of stochastic behavior, in interacting with the server, especially for something across the internet. However, there's been a lot of really interesting statistics work that allows them to do like real-life timing attacks even across the internet. Even with like small amounts of timing difference, you can reduce the problem to something that is tractable. So instead of doing 2 to the 128th, you're really doing what? 255 values times 16, right? That's a lot less work, right, than 2 to the 28th. A lot less, right? So even if you were going to guess, like millions of MACs, and maybe you submitted millions of MACs before you got one right, that's still far fewer, right? And that's something that's computationally tractable. All right, yeah.
James Bonet pulled out private keys from OpenSSL over the internet.
Yeah.
Like timing attacks.
Yeah.
No one really thought it was a thing.
Yeah, in fact, Nate Lawson, who is a Cal Poly student, actually found this error in Google's Keysar and kind of made so much of it. All right, so we talked a little bit about how do we use a block cipher. This is maybe a little complex, and so I'll go over it, at a very high level. And if it's confusing, you can ask me about it later. So if we want to encrypt something that's larger than a single AES block size, you got to think of that's what's in here, right? Each one of these boxes, you can think of it's AES. Well, we use something called a mode of operation, and one of those modes of operation is called cipher block chaining. And what I'm going to do is essentially take something called an initialization vector that essentially seeds a little bit of randomness into the encryption. I'm going to break my message up into fixed size blocks that I get put into AES. I'm going to encrypt that, and I get a ciphertext, and I'm going to use that next ciphertext kind of as part of to help randomize the next plaintext that creates the next ciphertext, and so on. Okay, this is actually the decryption circuit. Okay, so if I put in my ciphertext and I'm going to get out the plaintext again, and I'm going to XOR it with the initialization vector, take this ciphertext, decrypt it, and XOR it with the previous one to get this plaintext, okay, and so on. So that's all well and good. CBC mode, secure under some definition of security. And that definition is what we call semantic security, which presumes the adversary can't touch the message. They can just eavesdrop. And what the semantic security says is that I can't really distinguish the encryption of two messages, right? I might as well just kind of guess what messages, what that is, right? Or maybe it's indistinguishable from random, right? That's great, except when the adversary is allowed to touch the message. Okay? When they're allowed to touch things, we consider that a more powerful adversary and, frankly, more realistic. Right? Because as an adversary playing man in the middle, I can touch all kinds of packets. I can forge things. I can kind of submit random messages, right? This thing tends to fall apart, right? The security of this thing tends to fall apart if we're allowed to touch the ciphertext. And the reason is that we can somehow start manipulating what the plaintext will be if we can manipulate the previous ciphertext block. Why is that? Because of this XOR operation, right? So if I flip bit I in this ciphertext block, what's going to happen to bit I here? Also flipped. Yeah. So I can now start making meaningful decryptions. If I know kind of what the structure of this message is, think of protocols, right? Protocols have all kinds of structure. I can now start to maybe get something that I want to happen, not by decrypting it, but by kind of causing the decryption to decrypt to something that I want it to decrypt to. What's worse, this same principle can be used to actually figure out what the contents of the message is. And this has to do with something called a padding oracle. And a padding oracle is, I'm going to submit a message. Well, first of all, what is padding? Well, this still requires that the plain text be an integral number of the block size, right? So I've done a little bit better. I can now encrypt arbitrary size files so long as they're block aligned, so long as they're, well, what if they're not, right? I want to encrypt things on arbitrary byte lengths. What I do is something called padding. There's kind of these padding schemes that just allow me fill in the rest of the plain text with something that's unambiguously removable. So when I do a decryption, I'm going to look at the plain text and say, oh, this is padding. I'll just take out these bytes, these padding bytes, and there's the rest of my message. Well, a padding oracle is if I submit a ciphertext, I get 2 answers from you, okay? So let's say, I will put this in real context. Let's say I have a CBC encrypted cookie, okay? So I can send that to Bank of America, and it's go, okay, great. You're authorized to access this page. But what if that adversary sees that cookie and he wants to get that cookie? Because with that cookie, he can now impersonate you on Bank of America. But this adversary, I did not come up with this iconography, by the way. Yeah, they are adversarial, though. So you can take this baby, and he's going to start changing the ciphertexts. Okay? And basically, what a padding oracle says is one of 2 things. There was an error, and the error is because the padding was invalid, or the cookie was invalid. Right? So if I kind of flip a bit in the cookie and the cookie's not quite right, Bank of America is going to go, nope, that's not right. However, if I'm flipping bits towards the end of the message and that somehow screws up the padding, or the padding removing part goes like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, it's going to return this error. I'll go back one. So by knowing that, I can essentially start to figure out what the bytes of the plain text are by turning them into padding. Okay, so for example, imagine this is a plain text that was full, right? There was no padding in it. Okay, well, if I start playing with this last block, which I can by manipulating this last block. This block is just a byte, right? So I can start going through all 256 values of this byte, and one of these, I mean, nearly all of them, right? 255 of them are going to say padding error, padding error, padding error, until I get one that says valid padding. So now I know something. Now I know that some value here causes this byte to turn into valid padding. And by doing a little bit of algebra, I can figure out what value was there that caused that to turn into valid padding. I now know 1 byte of the decrypted plain text. Well, now that I know that byte, I can start messing with this byte until these 2 bytes say, yes, that was valid padding, and so on. And so again, it's a, kind of like it's a numerous attack. I've got to submit lots of things to but eventually, in far less work than going through all possible messages, I've now decrypted this plain text block. Yeah.
Do you more often see like an actual padding error message, or just a difference in timing?
Yes. So in real life, like in TLS, right? This was this message was distinguished by a difference in timing, and that was because it did MAC then encrypt, right? This is a kind of a subtlety, a more technicality. Essentially required both that kind of timing attack we talked about before and this padding attack. And the oracle was not on the error message itself, but I could distinguish between these 2 cases. Yeah, that existed in TLS 1.0. There was an attack against it called Beast. Actually, look up Beast on the YouTube. They have a great demo. They got a 4-minute video that shows them decrypting a PayPal cookie. Okay, and where do we see failures in protocol? Okay, so what is a protocol? Maybe you've kind of seen protocol diagrams that look like this. This is essentially the first phase. It's not exactly what I was looking for. It's very hard to find actually protocol diagrams of TLS that have like kind of the right things in them. But at the very high level, this is kind of the first phase, the handshake phase of TLS, where the client says, hey, I'm here. Here's the SSL version I speak. Here's my Cipher suites. Here are the things I say. And the server sends back, great, here are the things I support. Here's my certificate, which is essentially my public key bound to my identity. And maybe do you have a client certificate? Most of the time, we don't care about that. We don't really care about the authenticity of the client. We just want to prove that the server is who they are. Okay, so am I actually talking to Amazon? Amazon doesn't care that I'm me. Okay, there's maybe some circumstances where they might, right? But more often than not, they just want my money. Okay, they don't care where it comes from. Okay, so anyways, they kind of go through this complicated thing where they're going to agree upon something, and they're going to use some. Remember, their goal at this point is essentially to agree upon a symmetric key. And what they're going to do here is something called public key crypto. And public key has got some magic properties that allow them to share some values in the public that an adversary, even given those public values, can't really figure out what the end result is going to be. And that end result is going to be a shared secret, a secret key, which we'll then use for symmetric key, like AES. Right, symmetric key crypto. Why? Because AES is way faster. It's way faster than doing public key stuff. Public key tends to be really, really slow because it's based on kind of doing large multiplications or kind of doing a large number of exponentiations or whatever. There's kind of different. It's a different mathematical world, but it tends to be slower even on our fast computers. Okay. So one of the things that we'll do as part of that kind of negotiation is like, hey, I want to use RSA. RSA is a public key crypto scheme, and we'll agree upon our symmetric key using RSA. And so the server sends back, great. Let's talk RSA. Here are the parameters, and essentially the parameters for RSA. This is my public key. Okay, and N has some properties, and E has some properties, and there's some signature right on these values, so an adversary can't tamper with them as they go over the wire. Okay. Or alternatively, I say, I want to use Diffie-Hellman. Okay. Diffie-Hellman is another way we can agree upon a key, and it uses a kind of a different number theory to make that work. And there's kind of 3 parameters here. And so here are my Diffie-Hellman parameters, a prime, some generator of a prime order group, and some secret that I use to exponentiate that generator. And the signatures, you can't mess with the property. You can't mess with these parameters. If you could, that could be really bad, right? Because things like setting these values to all 0. Right, would essentially allow you to generate the 0 key. That would be predictable, and that would be bad. So at least we're not doing that. However, in old versions of SSL, there was a confusion. Like, while you couldn't mess with these parameters weren't bound to I'm speaking Diffie-Hellman. Okay? So one of the things you can do is like, hey, I'd like to talk RSA, and the baby comes in and says, nah, he wants to actually talk Diffie-Hellman. So the server says, great, here are your Diffie-Hellman parameters, and this guy thinks they're RSA parameters, okay? And so now instead of P and G, he assumes this is N and E. And this guy's like, well, what's that information? Who cares, okay? This is now N and E. Well, what is the requirement on N and E? Okay, well, one of the requirements on N for RSA is that it be the composite of 2 large prime numbers. Why? Because if I give you 2 prime numbers, 2 large prime numbers multiplied together, it's hard to actually figure out what those 2 numbers are. Right? We don't have very efficient algorithms for doing that. That's kind of the hardness assumption that RSA is based on. Well, what happens if I give you a number that's actually a prime? Okay, what are the 2 numbers that divide that prime number? Well, that number and 1. So yeah, and basically what I can do by knowing that, I can now figure out what this secret key is. Okay, this is called a cross-protocol attack, and was something that was exhibited in SSL 2, and then was fixed in SSL 3. However, what wasn't fixed in SSL 3 was a bug that allowed you to trick the client to go back to SSL 2. Okay, it's called a downgrade attack. Okay, so now I have a downgrade attack, now I can use a cross-protocol attack. Yeah, so these kind of things continue to snowball. Why do we still have SSL 3? Backwards compatibility. That was one of the things that Netscape tried to put into motion, that even as we improve things, we need to have support for the old versions because not everyone's going to upgrade their servers, not everyone's going to upgrade their web clients all at the same time. That's still true today, which is why we see still a large number of these SSL versions or TLS versions supported at the same time. All right. I got maybe 0 minutes left, but I got one more bonus thing. I kind of said 3 things that affect crypto. One of them is just software. It's harder to write software, right? And maybe the kind of most famous software bug we've seen in a while, Heartbleed, okay? Does everyone know Heartbleed? This is, again, picking on TLS. This is really, not to malign 101 students, but they're pretty bad at writing code, right? So this is like Heartbleed was like a 101 mistake. And so what is Heartbleed? Heartbleed is kind of a cute little name on the heartbeat protocol. So remember that I talked about doing that key establishment. That's expensive, right? So one of the things I'm going to do is like, if I'm going to talk to you a little bit later, I'm going to not tear down the session. I'm going to say, hey, I'm still here. Kind of hold on to your session keys. Let's not renegotiate. And I'm going to do that with a little heartbeat. Okay, hey, I'm still here. Hey, I'm still here. And here's how that heartbeat worked. And this is an XKCD that explains it like totally succinctly. So here's the adversary and say, hey, sir, are you still there? If so, potato. And potato is 6 letters long. Okay, and so user Meg wants these 6 letters potato, right? And it says potato back. Okay? Or I say, hey, you still there? I want bird. Bird is 4 letters long. And the server says, great, Yep, bird is 4 letters long. Here's bird, right? Hey, are you still there? Hat. Hat is 500 letters long. Okay, and the server goes, yep, great, hat is 500 letters long. Here are the 3 letters of hat, and then another 497 letters, okay? Well, where do those letters come from? They're in memory. Well, what's in memory? Private keys, passwords, right? Anything you said to a server, right, is now in memory. And so this is one way that attackers could essentially get the memory image of an SSL server, which probably included its private key, which meant all of its certificates were invalid. I mean, this essentially broke the internet, right? It broke the internet fundamentally. Heartbleed, still out there, right? Not everyone's upgraded or turned it off, right? It's just an option. This is one of the things that is kind of crazy, is that we kind of rushed to turn on all these optimization features when they're not really necessary. Most servers don't need to support this for most operations. It's kind of very rare that you actually want to do this. It's part of like, I mean, HTTP, just like it's a stateless protocol. Like, hey, give me this thing back again, good, we're done. Right? Why do I need to keep that open? Well, that's for kind of specific applications where I'm using a socket in a way that I wanted to stay open for longer than just a stateless protocol. So this was something that was kind of buried, some obscure extension to SSL or TLS that got buried in some RFC that some guy at the OpenSSL, some open source guy decided to write and commit and didn't check the length, right? Basically said, oh, great, yeah, I believe you. I believe that hat is 3 letters long or 500 letters long. There's been all kinds of implementation errors of that ilk. Okay, maybe you're familiar with go-to-fail, right? Another example of like copy and paste gone really awry, where it basically just jumped out of the code that was supposed to check something cryptographically important, and it didn't check it very well. It could always said, yeah, that's fine, even though it wasn't. All right, that's my time. I'm happy to answer some questions now. If you need to go, you won't hurt my feelings if you leave. But thank you for your time. Yeah.